An independent panel is questioning whether the province really needs the Lower Churchill Hydro project. The Environmental Assessment Panel released its report yesterday after years of work and months of hearings. Reporter Peter Cowan was there for those hearings and has been studying the 400-page document and the 80 recommendations. He's here now to give us the details. Peter, good morning.
Good morning, Colleen.
What concerns did the panel raise about the need for the project?
Well, all along, the main reason for developing Muskrat Falls has been to meet the needs of the island part of the province. And right now, the oil-fired generator at Holyrood provides any extra power, and it's expensive. So Nalcor says in the future there won't be enough power, and the price of oil is only going to keep going up. So that's why it argues that the province needs Muskrat Falls, even though the power there won't be cheap. But the panel is saying, hold on a second, you haven't looked at all the alternatives. There may in fact be a better option, something between Lower Churchill and the status quo. And it wants an independent analyst to look at all those different options. And here's what it said in the report. If the recommended economic and alternative study shows that there are alternative ways of meeting the electricity demands of the island over the medium term in a manner that's economically viable and environmentally and socially responsible, the Muskrat Falls portion of the project should likely not be permitted to proceed for the purposes of meeting island demand.
What other options are there?
Well, the panel lists a whole bunch of alternatives that it wants considered. These were things that were brought up at the hearings. One is something that this province has a lot of, and that's wind. The Helios Centre in Montreal prepared a report that said a wind farm on the Avalon Peninsula could produce all the power of Muskrat Falls at about half the cost. Another option would be converting Holyrood from oil to natural gas. Part of the reason for Muskrat Falls is that they say it's needed is the expectation that people will use more electricity. But one of the things you can do is you can spend money on helping people become more energy efficient, so you don't need more power, and then you don't have to build the dam. Another area to look at is smaller renewable options on the island, things like small-scale hydro or wind that would deliver enough power in the medium term because, as the panel points out, there is another option for the long term.
And what is that exactly?
Well, in 2041, this province will have all the power it needs thanks to Churchill Falls. That's when the deal with Quebec ends, and at that point, you would need to, of course, still build a transmission line to the island, but the power coming out of Churchill Falls at that point is basically free, so if you can get by until then, it may not make sense to develop Muskrat Falls.
Peter, what about Gull Island?
Well, it was supposed to be the first part of the project, if you remember way back when these plans started rolling out. But the problem is actually that it produces too much electricity. It's a much bigger project, and Nalcor just hasn't found a way to move all that power out through Quebec into markets in Ontario and the U.S. So that's why they decided we'll go with the smaller Muskrat Falls project first. The problem, though, is smaller means higher costs for every kilowatt hour of power that you're producing. So you may be able to get cheaper power if you can find the market for the Gull Island electricity.
What about the other 80 recommendations?
A lot of them are fairly minor. For example, things like atmospheric monitoring, erosion prevention, the continuation of training programs. But there are a few recommendations that would come with some pretty hefty price tags.
Like what?
Well, one of the big ones is reservoir clearing. Nalcor wants to only remove some of the trees in the reservoir, leaving most of the trees that are sitting below the water line. The panel is saying, no, we want you to remove all the trees at Muskrat Falls. So that would add tens of millions of dollars to the cost of the project, but the big problem is it would also take more time. So it would delay the project by up to a year while they cut all those extra trees, and so that could certainly be a problem for the project. Another costly recommendation revolves around what do you do at the end of the life of this project, the decommissioning of it. Nalcor says they don't have to worry about that because, in fact, dams are never removed. They're just upgraded, they're refurbished, and the panel is saying, wait a second, years or generations down the road, you may want to have this dam removed, so come up with a plan now, and more importantly, set aside the money now because if it happens, it could be very costly.
We heard from communities on the coast of Labrador that some of the power should be sent there to replace the diesel generators. Is that in their recommendations?
It's not. It did acknowledge that that was a request that they heard from many communities, and it's certainly one area that I'm sure many people on the coast are disappointed. The panel did say that Nalcor should look at environmentally sustainable ways of generating the power instead of the dirty and loud and smelly diesel generators, But it also acknowledged that it is a complicated issue and suggested that this is something that perhaps Nunatsiavut and Nalcor could work together to find some alternatives.
Happy Valley Goose Bay is closest to the project. What issues did the panel raise with that community?
Yeah, Happy Valley Goose Bay is the community that the panel says both has the most to gain from this project, but also the most to lose. For example, there will be an influx of workers, which means jobs and training opportunities, but we also heard about concerns during the hearings on strains on infrastructure, for example. The panel wants Nalcor and the province to enter an agreement with the town to assess the impact of the project and come up with a plan to deal with unexpected infrastructure costs. What happens if you need to put in a new dump? What happens if there's an extra strain on roads? How are you going to pay for all of that? We also heard, for example, that at the hospital, right now there aren't enough nurses to deal with all the people in town. And if you've got this big project, there's going to be an extra strain on addictions, mental health services. So the panel wants a commitment from government that it's going to provide any of the resources needed to deal with these extra strains created by the project. Another big concern that was raised, especially by the women's groups in town, was to deal with social housing. Right now, it's already hard enough to find a reasonably priced apartment or an apartment at all. So what happens when you have a boom? More people are moving into town. So the panel is saying, Nalcor, sit down with other levels of government, sit down with the town, and come up with a strategy. How are you going to deal with low-income housing needs?
What about Mud Lake that is so dependent on the river for transportation?
Yeah, the panel says Nalcor should cover all the costs related to providing transportation to and from the community if it takes any longer than 2 weeks for freeze-up or thawing. So that's the period when you can't use your boat yet, but your snowmobile won't ride over the ice yet. And what it is sort of warning is that a road may not be the solution. Certainly there's a lot of resistance to the idea of building a road. So it's saying, Nalcor, you need to find a way to provide transportation that is consistent with the demands and the wishes of the community. So that may be, for example, providing helicopter shuttle service back and forth. But it's leaving it up to Nalcor to how to do that, sort of in consultation with the communities.
What is the panel saying about the issue of a dam break?
Well, that was one issue that the Grand River Keepers were concerned about, and it came up a number of times during the hearings. And there is a recommendation there about developing an emergency plan and even a warning system for Happy Valley Goose Bay to give people about 2 hours' notice in the very unlikely event that the dam actually breaks. The panel is also saying that if that ever did happen, one of the conditions should be that Nalcor would be responsible to cover all the costs associated with any the loss of property and damage in the Upper Lake Melville area for whatever reason that the dam happened to fail.
So in the end, does this panel think that this project will be a benefit to Newfoundland and Labrador?
They say it's going to be mixed. They say with Gull Island as well as Muskrat Falls that it is likely to provide a net benefit to the entire province, but they say they're not sure how much benefit there will actually be for Labrador. In the report they write, whether the project would also deliver net benefits to Labrador depends on whether enough of the revenues generated from the project are reinvested in Labrador. And it also says that when it dealing with the big picture, that the financial and alternatives assessment would go a long way to confirming whether a net benefit is likely.
So, Peter, what's the next step here?
Well, these are only recommendations, and that's important to remember. It's up to the federal and provincial ministers of the environment to decide whether or not to adopt some or all or none of them. Nalcor has also been busy studying the report. They only got it at the same time as the rest of us, so we're expecting to hear from them today. So it'll be interesting to see what of these recommendations they'll adopt on their own, and especially that big independent assessment that has everyone talking.
Thanks, Peter, for filling us in this morning.
Oh, you're welcome, Colleen.
That's the CBC's Peter